In 2020, millions of American families suddenly found themselves doing something they had not necessarily planned to do: managing school from home. For some, it was chaos, and for others, it was temporary. But for a significant number of families, it became something else entirely. It became a doorway. And that doorway is the focus of my research project. Hello, fellow historians. I'm Andrea Henderson. My paper, Homeschooling and COVID-19, The Making of an Educational Marketplace, asks this central question: how did the COVID-19 pandemic accelerate the development of homeschooling from a marginal educational alternative into a consumer-driven and increasingly state-supported educational marketplace? That question is historically significant because the story of homeschooling after COVID-19 is not just a story about families leaving school buildings. It is a story about American education becoming more flexible, more privatized, more commercial, and more difficult to categorize. Before beginning this project, I think it would have been easy to treat homeschooling as either a private family decision or a temporary pandemic reaction, but the evidence points to something bigger. COVID-19 didn't create homeschooling, obviously. It didn't invent parental dissatisfaction with public schools. It didn't invent online curriculum, private education companies, school choice policy, or state-funded alternatives. But what COVID-19 did was reveal how ready those pieces already were. Methodologically, I approach this project as a historical study of change over time. But because the topic sits at the intersection of education, business, public policy, I also used policy analysis and market analysis. I wanted to know not only how homeschooling grew, but how it became connected to companies, digital platforms, curriculum markets, and public funding. My primary sources fell into three major categories. First, I used federal data from the U.S. Census Bureau and the National Center for Education Statistics to measure the shift in homeschooling before, during, and after the pandemic. Second, I used corporate and market sources, including Stride annual reports and homeschool curriculum market reports, to examine how education companies understood that shift. These sources have to be used carefully because corporate and market reports are not necessarily neutral. They're often written for investors, customers, or for growth forecasting. Third, I used Arizona legislation, Arizona Department of Education ESA reports, fiscal documents, and the ESA parent handbook. Arizona became my case study because it shows what happens when parent-directed education becomes linked to public funding. Its ESA, or Empowerment Scholarship Account program, demonstrates how education choice can move from private preference into state-supported purchasing. It's an interesting phenomenon. My first major finding is that homeschooling had deep roots before COVID-19, obviously, and modern homeschooling emerged in the 1970s and 80s from a mix of pedagogical critics, religious conservative, libertarian thinkers, and parents just skeptical of institutional schooling. By 2020, homeschooling had already had legal recognition, some curriculum networks, religious and secular communities involved, and a growing digital infrastructure. So COVID-19 did not create the movement, obviously, but it did change the scale tremendously. My second major finding is that the pandemic functioned like an accelerant. So it just accelerated what was already in motion. School closures and emergency remote learning forced families into educational experimentation. Some parents discovered that they hated it, and some returned to conventional schools as quickly as possible. But others realized that schooling did not have to look the way it had looked before. The pandemic didn't simply increase homeschooling numbers. It made alternative education more imaginable, feasible, or achievable. Learning pods, micro schools, co-ops, online curriculum, hybrid programs, and virtual providers all became more visible. Families who might never have considered homeschooling suddenly had experience with home-based education. They had experience with digital tools and parent-directed learning. My third major finding is that by the mid-2020s, homeschooling had become part of a broader educational marketplace. The homeschool parent was no longer only the instructor at the kitchen table. Increasingly, the parent became a purchaser, a manager, and evaluator of educational products. Families could buy curriculum, tutoring, online programs, assessment, micro school services, hybrid instruction, or full digital learning platforms. That's a major shift. It means homeschooling was no longer just an alternative to school. In many cases, it became a way of entering a marketplace of educational options. Arizona makes this especially clear. Arizona's ESA program is not the same thing as traditional homeschooling necessarily. The distinction does matter, but it does show how parent-directed education can become part of a publicly funded purchasing system. Arizona created the nation's first ESA program in 2011 and pursued expansion before COVID-19, then adopted universal ESA eligibility quality in 2022. So by fiscal year 2025, the Arizona Department of Education reported 85,195 active ESA students and more than $881 million in annualized scholarship awards. And that number matters because it shows the mechanism behind the transformation. Public funds can become private educational purchasing power, and parents are not just choosing outside the public school system. In some cases, they're using state-administered funds to purchase curriculum. In some cases, online learning. Some cases tutoring, and in some cases other educational materials and services from private providers. The larger significance of my research is that homeschooling has become a window into the restructuring of American education itself. This is not just a pandemic story. It is a business story, a policy story, and a story about how Americans increasingly imagine education as customizable, portable, and purchasable. My conclusion is not that this development is automatically good or bad. The evidence does not allow for that kind of simple answer, of course, but questions about academic quality, accountability, public cost, and equity remain unresolved. But historically, the shift is clear. Between 2015 and 2025, homeschooling moved from a relatively stable educational alternative into a more visible, commercialized, and institutionally embedded sector. COVID-19 did not build the marketplace from scratch. It opened the door wider. And once that door opened, families, companies, policymakers, and public funds all moved through it. Thank you for watching.